करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती है झर झर, अनवरत झरती झर झर झर, तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। मम हृदय पात्र अति लघु, माँ इसे विशाल बना। तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी, तू अमृत सुधा देने को खड़ी। हम अज्ञानवश करते मना, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, हम तेरी संतान ज्ञानी। माँ हमें तू मार्ग दिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यह प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, कैसे ग्रहण करे यह प्रेम सुधा। पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा, पात्र यंत्र का पाठ सिखा। माँ हमें वह पाठ सिखा। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके। अनवरत झरती झर झर झर, तू हमसे कहती हृदय में अपने, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर, मेरी प्रेम सुधा रस भर भर भर। करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके, करुणावारी है मीरांबिके माँ।
My dear brothers and sisters, the love and blessings of the Mother and Sri Aurobindo to all of you from Sri Aurobindo Ashram, Delhi branch. This devotional song, in the melodious voice of Mithu, addresses the compassionate aspect of the Mother. She's all compassionate, all merciful, and the devotee realizes that although her grace is always available to us, her compassion is always available to us. In our own ignorance, we keep rejecting it, and therefore the prayer is for enlarging our heart, for giving us that receptivity so that we can receive what she is giving us out of all her generosity and love. That is the common sort of tale. Sri Aurobindo says in Savitri, hard is the world redeemer's task. The one who wants to help the world has a hard task ahead of him, because The people whom he is trying to help are not ready for it. They keep rejecting it in their ignorance. And the extreme case is, of course, of Jesus Christ, apparently referring to which Aurobindo again says in Savitri, uh, cross is the payment for the crown. The one who promises the kingdom of God, the crown, the payment that the humanity gives to him is the cross. A very appropriate devotional song for today's topic, which is prayer and healing. While it is very common, almost universal, and instinctive to turn to a higher power when we are in trouble, uh, it's when all is going well that we have that type of a resistant attitude, which was referred to in the devotional song that you just heard. But when a person finds that he is facing, or his near and dear ones are facing, a situation in which the person finds himself helpless, all the resources of which the person was proud turn out to be totally useless. It is in that situation that there is a tendency to turn to a higher power, turn to the divine, because one realizes that, yes, there is still a power available who can save us, for whom everything is easy, and therefore we turn to him. As the Gita says, there are four types of devotees. Chaturvidha bhajante mam. Sri Krishna says that there are four types of people who worship me and are my devotees. And the first amongst those four categories is the artha. That is the one who is miserable, one who is in a difficult situation. And illness can be one of those difficult situations in which a person turns into a devotee. And there is nothing wrong with it, because as again Sri Krishna says that all types of devotees are acceptable to me. So even if it is in a state of misery that we turn to him, that is quite acceptable to the Lord. The uh, only thing is that it should not stay there. One should move in our devotion from that devotion which was uh, triggered by the misery to a devotion which is more and more pure, more and more sincere, more and more motiveless. A devotion which is rooted in the joy of the relationship, the personal relationship that we end up establishing with the divine. That relationship itself becomes more important to us than anything else that the prayer might bring to us. So, with that little background, let's turn to today's video. Sorry, no, today's PowerPoint. The topic is prayer and healing. Let me start with this quotation from Gandhiji. It's better in prayer to have a heart without words than words without a heart. So, prayer is essentially something emotional, something that comes from the heart, not from the intellect that has tendency to argue, calculate, and so on. And therefore, that attitude of the heart itself is enough. No words formulated at the level of the intellect are really necessary, and may be done away with altogether. So, what is important is to have a heart, even if it is without words, than to have well formulated words which come from the head without that component of the heart. So, when we are in trouble, to think of the divine, to start praying is something universal. But then the question that we are going to address today is, does it help and does it work? There's a shade of a difference between the two. When it is, does it help? It's very easy to say yes. because if nothing else, at least it makes us feel good. It brings us peace of mind, both to the person who is praying and the person who is prayed for. So the focus today will be more on what is called intercessory prayer. That is praying for somebody else, praying for your near and dear ones. Uh, so whether it is the one who is praying or the one for whom he is praying, both get a lot of solace, comfort, peace of mind, and also the confidence that now that our contact has been established with a higher power, the confidence that the best would happen. So it does help. But does it work? Now, when it comes to does it work, we are turning to the intellectual aspect of it, the scientific aspect, which demands proof. That is there any proof that when we pray, there is actually a divine intervention which alters the outcome in the direction in which we want it to happen? So, is the prayer answered by the divine by molding its will in such a way that the outcome that we want is more likely? In other words, we expect the divine to listen to us and mold its will rather than do what it wills. So it looks a little uh, preposterous, but all the same, essentially that is what is implied. And the scientific investigations on prayer actually try to see whether it does really happen. Whether it happens as a result of the divine intervention is secondary, but at least is the effect of prayer that at least what we wish for, is it more likely to happen as a result of prayer itself? So that is the type of difficult question that scientific studies tend to ask. Comes big. Mind body medicine is something which is quite widely accepted. Of course, nothing new. Ayurveda talked about the mind body relationship, Hippocrates talked about the mind body relationship, but then modern medicine had forgotten it uh, for about 100 years when it started making spectacular advances. And some of those advances were not only spectacular, they did not require the participation of the patient's mind. For example, if you give insulin, the blood sugar will come down no matter what the patient is thinking. And the diabetes was more or less conquered that way, in the sense that after the discovery of insulin, in the clinical picture of diabetes changed dramatically. A person with diabetes could hope to live a full span of life and a productive life. So there were many spectacular advances, and in the euphoria of those advances, we forgot the mind-body relationship. But then it has come back with a stronger scientific footing. So mind-body relationship is now pretty well accepted and has a strong scientific footing. What is essentially mind-body medicine? Mind-body medicine essentially means that we use the power of the patient's mind to heal the patient's body. That is, the uh, patient's mind can be used uh, by the patient trusting that I will get well, patient having faith in the self-healing mechanisms of the body, the patient having faith in the doctor to whom he has gone, patient having faith in the treatment that the doctor is giving. All this makes the patient feel that I will get well. And if the patient thinks that he will get well, the chances of his actually getting well improve enormously. So that is what mind-body relationship is about. Mind-body medicine is about. But prayer goes beyond that. The person himself may pray, but the focus today is on somebody else praying for the patient. Can that also be effective? So here we are talking about the effect of the doctors or the healers or the well-wishers' mind on the patient's body. Can this type of a prayer by the healer or a well-wisher also improve the chances of healing? That is the question that we are trying to address. So in that sense, it goes beyond mind-body medicine. Mind-body medicine uses the powers of the patient's own mind on healing his own body, whereas here we are trying to investigate the effect of somebody else's mind on healing the patient's body. In one way, one might say that even uh, the effects of prayer don't really go beyond mind-body medicine, because if the person is praying and the person knows that a well-wisher is praying for me, then it gives the patient some confidence that now I'm under the care of the most competent doctor in the universe. And therefore, I'm likely to get well. So the patient feels confident that, yes, I will get well. And that is what helps the recovery of the patient. So once again, it is the mind of the patient which is helping the patient's body heal, even if it is somebody else praying for the patient. The other aspect, which is even more valuable in a way, is that the patient now feels that I am in touch myself and through my well wishers with the one who knows everything, the one who can do everything, and the one who knows what is best for me, and therefore surrenders to the outcome determined by the divine. So he doesn't think that the what I want is necessarily the best outcome. He trusts and surrenders to the outcome determined by the divine. In other words, he surrenders not only to the divine will, but also to the divine wisdom. Surrendering to the divine will, in any case, we don't have much choice. We have to surrender because the outcome doesn't always is not always what we wanted, and once the outcome is there, we may attribute it to the divine, but whether we attribute it to the divine or otherwise, in any case, we have no choice. But when we surrender also to the divine wisdom, we believe that yes, what the divine wills will happen, thy will be done. But what the divine determines, the outcome determined by the divine, is the best possible for us. Because the divine is all wise. We ourselves may not know what is really good for us. So we surrender happily to the outcome determined by the divine. When it comes to scientific studies, that is, studies which have tried to address this question uh, from the intellectual point of view, they started long back. And some of the earliest studies were done by Francis Galton, who was not only a statistician and therefore well qualified for this type of analysis which these studies required, but he was a polymath in the sense that he was very widely read, a scholar, and would be considered an expert in a very wide variety of diverse fields. And some of the studies that he did in this area compared the lifespan of the clergy, doctors, and lawyers. And the assumption was that since the clergymen pray a lot, if prayer really helps in staying healthy and living longer, clergy should live longer. But then the results were not very convincing because although the clergy did live longer than doctors and lawyers, he found that eminent clergy actually lived shorter than eminent doctors and eminent lawyers. So the results were not really uh, clear cut. Another study that he did compared the lifespan of the royalty and that of the affluent. Why royalty? Because in England, they pray, long live the king. So if so many people throughout the country are praying for the long life of the king should actually live longer. And the control that he took were the well-to-do, the affluent people. Why? Because the king is also affluent. So he thought that affluent people would be a good control. Compare, because nobody is praying for them. Do they live less than the royalty for whom so many people are praying throughout the country every day? But actually, he found that the results were paradoxical. The lifespan of the royalty was slightly shorter than that of the well-to-do. And of course, that didn't mean that the prayer was ineffective, because one could argue that if the people had not been praying for the king might have lived even less than he actually did. Because the king has so many responsibilities to share, or so many responsibilities, so much of uh, work. So, under the weight of all that responsibility that he's carrying, he would actually live much less. It's only because of prayer the king manages to live only slightly less than the other well-to-do people in the country. So that was the sort of argument one can use and say that still. So it means that firstly, the study is not flawless. Secondly, the results are not very convincing. And certainly the control in the case was inappropriate because although well conceived that well-to-do people can be a good control for the royalty, a proper control would have been royalty which is not prayed for. That is another set of kings for whom nobody is praying. That would have been the appropriate control. Relatively recently, there have been other studies, and they have been along these lines, comparing the health and lifespan of those who visit a place of worship compared with the lifespan and health of those who do not. And it has been found, this has been more or less a universal finding, that those who visit a place of worship at least once a week do better. But that again does not necessarily mean that it has proven that going to a place of worship and praying there makes a person live longer or stay more healthy. Because quite possible that those who go to a place of worship regularly are also the ones who are likely to be non-smokers and have a better eating and drinking habits. And also it's quite possible that those who visit a place of worship regularly are likely to have less stress. Less stress because prayer makes the person feel more at peace. And also, by meeting the same set of people at the place of worship regularly, they build up sort of an informal social support system. So they are less under stress. And this is what might be helping them. But one of the most ingenious objections to this type of studies is that those who have poor health, because of their poor health, it's difficult for them to visit a place of worship. Uh, so it's not that uh, they're not going to the place of worship leads to poor health. Their poor health leads to they're not going to the place of worship. So the cause and the effect relationship can be easily reversed using logic, which means that these studies again remain inconclusive, although the health and lifespan of those who visit a place of worship is better than that of those who do not go to this place of worship regularly. Now, against this background, there was this person, Larry Dossey, who was a young medical student in the 1960s, came across a study on the positive effects of prayer in getting well. And he got interested in it. He had that sort of inclinations. He had studied Buddhism and he had that sort of an inclination. And therefore, when he saw this type of a study, he started searching for more studies along the same lines and discovered that there were about 100 other studies available, satisfying fairly well the criteria of science. And most of these studies had shown positive effects of prayer on health and healing. And therefore, he questioned what the attitude of doctors should be to these studies. And he discovered that the attitude in general was to ignore these studies. And if one tries to discuss them, also hostile. And therefore, medical students were not taught anything about these studies or such in this subject in their medical curriculum. This was not there. But then he came to the conclusion that if there are so many studies available, and prayer in any case is something completely innocuous, which can have only positive side effects, so why not pray? And therefore, he thought, in fact, he came to the conclusion, rather sort of emphatic conclusion, that not to employ prayer for my patients would amount to denying them a potent therapeutic tool. And so he started praying for his patients, and he discovered that although it was not discussed openly and it was considered unscientific, a lot of doctors were doing it, especially the surgeons. Before they started surgery, they would still pray. Because, they know that when they give an incision, when they cut open any part of the body, and then they stitch it up, the healing of even that wound that they create, leave aside whatever surgery they do inside, depends not on the stitching that they do, but on the natural healing mechanisms. Because all they are doing while stitching it up is to bring the two cut ends of the skin in close contact with each other. It's after that the self-healing mechanisms and once again restore the continuity of the skin. So the surgeon understands all this, and therefore most surgeons were actually praying before starting their operations. Then came in 1988 a revolutionary study by Randolph Bird on coronary care patients. And he used the type of approach that is used for studying drugs. When you have a new drug to try, then you go in for what is called a randomized double-blind controlled trial. We shall come to what this type of trial is a little later. But then he had sort of uh, in this about 400 patients, and he divided them into two comparable groups. One group was prayed for, it had 192 patients, and the control group was not prayed for and consisted of 201 patients. Prayed for means that he collected a set of volunteers who were ready to pray for some patients. So he told them that you pray for 192 patients who are in the coronary care unit. Those who were praying didn't know for which patients they were praying. And out of these 400 or so patients, none of them knew whether they belonged to the prayed for group or the not prayed for group, which group they belonged to. They knew that this type of study is going on, but they didn't know which group they belonged to. So in that sense, it was double blind. The patients were blind. Those who were praying for them were blind. And in such studies, generally the doctors who are taking care of the patients, they are also blinded. They also don't know which of their patients is being prayed for and which is not being prayed for. This code is kept a secret by some key investigator, and the doctors who are actually treating, they don't know, to make it as objective as possible. And he found in the study that the prayed for patients needed less antibiotics, needed endotracheal intubation, for breathing difficulties, putting a tube into the trachea. They needed that less often, and had a lower incidence of pulmonary edema, one of the complications in the lungs in these patients. But then he studied not just these three, he studied 23 variables or parameters, as it's commonly called, 20 other variables. Out of these 23 variables, some positive effect was seen on only three. With respect to the other 20, there was no significant difference between the patients who were prayed for and those who were not prayed for. But all the same, although these effects are weak and one can't really draw a very emphatic conclusion, the study was revolutionary in the sense that it was a pretty large scale study done very methodically, satisfying the criteria of good science the way you study a new drug. So that type of criteria, it satisfied fairly well. But then since it was a controversial topic, he could publish it only in some obscure medical journal, South Medical Journal or something. But then, all in spite of that, it raised a lot of controversy, invited a lot of correspondence, and then Larry Dossey stepped in, who was already positively influenced in favor of prayer. So against all the criticism which uh, Randolph Bird study got, he prepared a very good defense, defending the study. So the result was that the medical profession suddenly became aware of this type of studies, and many other people got interested in doing such studies. And one study along similar lines was published in 1999. And by then, the receptivity to this type of studies had built up, and therefore, instead of publishing it in an obscure medical journal, they succeeded in publishing it in a very respectable uh, and reputed old journal with a long-standing journal, Archives of Internal Medicine. They studied about still more patients. They had 990 patients, and they studied 33 variables. But then the results were even uh, less strong, much weaker than even in Bird study. They prayed for patients needed less of Swan-Ganz catheter. Now, this really is not an indicator of how well the patients are getting, except that this catheter is introduced into the right heart, and maybe if there's some complication to get to the root of the complication, you might put this catheter. So this was the only positive result. With respect to the other 32 variables, there was no significant difference between the patients who were prayed for and those who were not prayed for. But all the same, this subject of study became more and more acceptable and fashionable during that period, and perhaps still continues to be studied. And the result is that today, if you put in Google search, and I did that only yesterday, uh, found that if you put this in the Google search prayer and healing studies, you get uh, this many results within 0.58 seconds. Now, many of these studies are what are called reviews and meta-analyses. Meta-analysis means you study a large number of studies which are somewhat similar and comparable and pool the results of all those to arrive at more firm conclusions. The general sort of lines along which these reviews talk is that these studies are very heterogeneous. Every study has been done in a different way, and therefore it's difficult to do a meta-analysis. But they all the same concede that this topic, although controversial, merits more studies. And one general conclusion is that prayer seems to help those the most who believe in the powers of prayer, which is quite understandable. Which means perhaps once again it is the mind of the patient working on the patient's body. And Wikipedia, in its article on efficacy of prayer, quotes this study that in 2006, which concludes that the psychological benefits of prayer may help reduce stress and anxiety, promote a more positive outlook, and strengthen the will to live. Which means essentially they are influencing the patient's mind at least positively, so that through the mind body relationship, the reduction in stress and anxiety and the positive outlook and the strengthening the will to live on the part of the patient could itself promote healing and recovery. And we have plausible evidence for this, not only statistical, but also at the mechanismal level through the psychoneuroimmunological studies that the psychological makeup can have important physiological consequences. So if the patient has less stress and anxiety, has a more positive outlook, if he has a strong will to live, then this patient's immune system becomes stronger. And if the immune system is strong, it can help in the prevention of many diseases and also in recovery from a wide variety of diseases, not just infections, but also serious illnesses like cancer. So it can help in the recovery from all those, just this change in the attitude of the patient. And that apparently prayer seems to achieve. On this, there is a general consensus. Now let's try and see a little more to understand and be able to look at the studies of this type critically. What exactly is a randomized controlled trial? This is generally done for a new drug which has to be tried, and there are two comparable groups of patients. Patients are divided into two comparable groups in a randomized fashion, which means that there is no sort of uh, criteria by which they are divided in such a way that there may be a bias which patient to put on the experimental group, which in the control group, which is not receiving this drug, the pill group and the no pill group, which is not receiving this. So who goes to which group, that is decided in a random fashion. Randomized numbers, you can have tables of randomized numbers or computer generated random numbers, but there's no human bias involved in deciding who goes to which group. So that way, the two groups are comparable in terms of severity and other things, and the allotment to the two groups is completely random. And the control group is the no pill group, so that you can compare how much better, if at all, those who receive the new drug do as compared to those who do not receive this new drug. But then, if the patient knows that I'm not receiving the drug, that itself could influence the results negatively. So those who do not get the pill also get something. What they get is a placebo. Placebo is again a pill which looks like the pill which is being tried, and it also tastes like the pill which is being tried, but it does not contain the drug. It contains some inert substances like sugar. So the no pill group receives a placebo. But then the patients do not know whether they are receiving the pill or they are receiving only the placebo. And their doctors also do not know which patient of theirs is receiving the pill, who is receiving the placebo. Because otherwise, when they are taking the rounds in the wards, if they know it, then the one who is receiving the pill, to those patients, their attitude might be different. They might show that confidence, reflect that confidence that this patient will get better. Whereas the one who is not receiving the pill, who is receiving the placebo, they might feel some sort of a compassion. Poor fellow, he's not getting the drug. How will he get well? So, that sort of that may get reflected in the way they talk to the patient and therefore even the doctors who are treating them do not know who among their patients is receiving the pill and who is getting the placebo. This code, that is, who got the pill and who got the placebo, this is broken after a pre-decided time, the 4 weeks, 8 weeks, or whatever time is fixed. And then everybody knows who got what, and you can analyze the results. Now, the so-called good studies, these revolutionary studies which started with Bird, they used a similar approach in the case of prayer. But the results were weak and controversial, as we have seen. And therefore, there was a group of probably 3 doctors who got together and said that, well, all these studies have been flawed studies, and that's why we can't arrive at any definitive conclusions. We'll now design a study very carefully in such a way that it is totally flawless, and we can reach definitive conclusions whether or not prayer is really effective in promoting healing and recovery. So they sat down and they discussed and they discussed. And some of the arguments that came up in the discussion were that we'll see just now. But just to show the design again of these studies, which have been done earlier. In this case, there were volunteers who prayed, and these volunteers were arranged by the investigator. The not prayed for group, for them, no such volunteers were arranged. Placebo was not possible. But at the same time, volunteers did not know whom they were praying for. The patients did not know which group they belonged to, whether they were being prayed for or not being prayed for. And the doctors treating them also did not know who amongst their patients belonged to which group. So the design was very similar to the randomized controlled trial for a pill, except that here a placebo was not possible. Now, a group of 3 doctors got together and discussed how they could perform a flawless study on this subject. And some of the arguments that came up were not only that the placebo was not possible, but there were many other arguments on the issue. One of them was that they may not organize volunteers to pray for the patients, but neither is it possible nor it would be ethical to stop the patients themselves in both the groups from praying. They can't even stop the relatives and friends in either group from praying for them. So even in the group which was not being prayed for, the investigators may not have organized any volunteers, but that could not stop the relatives and friends of even the not prayed for group from praying for them. So the result was that when it comes to intercessory prayer, that is praying by the relatives and friends and or the volunteers who had been organized. In the prayed for group, suppose n number of volunteers had been organized by the investigator to pray for these people. And in addition, p number of relatives and friends were praying for them. In the not prayed for, only q number. Now the assumption is that n plus p is greater than q. But then you cannot be sure whether this assumption is really valid. Even if this assumption is valid, does the effect of prayer depend upon the number of people praying? Is it like a pill that the higher the dose, the more will be the effect? Does prayer also have a dose effect relationship? You can't be sure about that. So, does the effect of prayer depend on the number of prayers, or does it depend on the intensity and sincerity of the prayers, which cannot be measured? The number can be measured, the dose of a pill can be measured, but the intensity and sincerity of the prayer cannot be measured. Then the question arises, is the prayer offered by everyone of the same, will prayer by everybody have the same effect? Is the prayer offered by an ordinary prayer as effective as that by a holy person? And if that by a holy person is more effective, then will the holy person's prayer be equal to 100 ordinary people's prayers, 1,000, or 1,000,000 prayers offered by ordinary persons? Then another important thing is that we are trying to judge or assess the efficacy of the prayer by measuring survival. How many people survived a serious illness in the prayed for group and not prayed for group. So the outcome measured is survival. Is survival the best outcome in God's logic? Leave aside God's inscrutable logic. In a person who is going through misery and is unlikely to recover completely, sometimes even human logic says that it's better for this person to die than to survive. So the outcome itself is controversial, but at the same time, in these studies, universally, the outcome measured is survival. So the conclusion these people, after discussing this issue for many days, was that these questions are impossible to answer, all the questions that they raised. Therefore, a flawless scientific study on the subject cannot be done. And this study was also published in the Archives of Internal Medicine in 2001. So if this is the conclusion, and this conclusion seems to be pretty sort of a valid conclusion, because all the questions that they raised are so valid and same time so impossible to answer, then why drag providence-based medicine into the complexities of evidence-based medicine? Now, this happens because we live in an era of science, and the scientific enterprise has been so successful over the last 300 to 400 years. It has so revolutionized our lives that to be scientific has become almost a synonym for being good, valid, and worthwhile, although they are not synonyms, because the limits of truth are much wider than the limits of science. But all the same, if it is not scientific, it is almost felt as if it cannot be true. But and that is why there is this tendency to try and study everything from the scientific point of view. And if it cannot be done, then there's a tendency to dismiss it as something which cannot be true or which is invalid, and which it would not be right to depend upon. Now, something related to, somewhat similar to, but distinctly different from just prayer and healing is the subject of spiritual healing. And Daniel Benor, who has done a lot of work in this area, defines it like this, that it's the intentional influence of one or more people upon another living system without utilizing no physical means of intervention. Some sort of a spiritual medium, which is not a physical medium, uh, and you are using this medium to translate the intention of a person, because prayer is essentially an intention, on another living system, who may be a human being or who may be some plant or some other animal. So one can pray for even an animal or a plant. So intentional pray, or one can have an intention, a positive intention towards. So this, the idea here of calling it intentional influence, etc., is to uh, be completely neutral and without bringing in anything related to divine or even spiritual. So essentially, what we are studying is something which is indefinable, not physical, which therefore may be considered spiritual, but one can be more neutral in saying that it is something that is not utilizing any physical means of intervention. And instead of calling it prayer, we are calling it an intention. So spiritual healing is intentional influence of one or more people upon another living system without utilizing known physical means of intervention. He reviewed 131 studies of this type on spiritual healing, and he found that there were positive results in 56 of those studies. And here, interestingly, the non-human studies are more convincing than human studies, because we have seen that one of the major objections, which is impossible to overcome in case of human studies, is that the person gets more confident if he is praying, and if he knows that his well-wishers are praying for him, he gets still more confident that I will get well. So because the person thinks that I'll get well, that's the reason why he gets well. So essentially, it is the mind of the patient himself working on his body rather than the effect of prayer or spiritual intention, or a good intention on the part of his well-wishers. So that is not what is working. It is essentially still the mind-body relationship of the patient himself at work. Now, in non-human studies, that objection seems less valid, and let's see how. Among animal studies, one of the studies that has been quoted a lot is one in which there were two groups of mice that were taken. Both were given identical surgical incisions, which were then stitched up. And then these animals were divided into two groups. In one group, a spiritual healer held the cage of the animal for the animals, or wished healing, faster healing of the animal who were there in the cage, which the healer lifted up. So the healer, the spiritual healer, held the cage in his hand for 15 minutes a day for one group of mice, but not for the other group of mice. And it was found that those mice whose cages were held by the spiritual healer every day did actually, in their case, the incision did heal faster. But then one might say that a mouse is also not as different from a human being. And maybe the mice were enjoying the extra attention that they were getting when the healer was holding their cage lovingly in his hands. And therefore, it was once again the mind body relationship of the mice which helped rather than the uh, intentions of the spiritual healer. Now, how about plants? Plants perhaps don't have a mind like ours, but then it has been found, and those who do gardening, they also know it, that if you handle the plant lovingly, then the plant does much better. It stays more healthy, it grows, it survives longer. So there is an influence of holding of the loving intentions of the gardener, leave aside a spiritual healer, on the growth and survival of the plants. And that is in spite of the fact that plants don't probably enjoy that extra attention the way an animal or a human being does. But then who knows? Plants may have their own way of enjoying that extra attention. So let's go down, further down in the evolutionary scale. Microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, all types of tiny organisms who may not even be able to enjoy that extra attention the way a plant might. Uh, Again, it has been found that if you have uh, culture plates in which these microorganisms are growing, divided into two groups, and for one of those groups, uh, somebody is wishing, willing, or intending faster growth or slower growth. For the other group, nobody is doing any such thing. Then the group of or microorganisms for whom this type of wishing, willing, and intending is going on, they actually seem to respond positively to this. If the intention is to make them grow faster, they grow faster. If the intention is to make them grow slower, they grow slower. So now this becomes more convincing. Let's go further down to not full-fledged organisms, but just cells which are in a culture. What it means is that, we have taken some cells, say, from the cancer cells from a biopsy. Now, this is not a full-fledged organism. A, a patient happened to have cancer, you've taken a biopsy and uh, kept those cells alive in a medium, in a fluid, which provides all the nourishment, oxygen, etc., needed by these cells. So they'll continue to survive for quite some long time. They survive, they divide, they live like single-celled organisms, but they're not full-fledged organisms. Now, these cells can't have a mind like human beings or animals or even plants. But then again, if you divide them into two groups, one group, you pray for their slower growth. Cancer cells, you would like them to grow slowly because you want to then further extrapolate it to living human beings and expect that in, if the cancer patient prays or some well-wishers pray for him, then uh, you want to make sure whether uh, it will be effective. And that's what you're trying to investigate in these. So for one group of cells in the culture, say cancer cells, the prayer is for slower growth. For the other group, there's no such prayer going on, prayer or healing intention. Then you find that if the intention conveyed is slower growth, the cells do grow slower. There's a statistically significant difference in the rate of growth of these two sets of cells growing in culture medium, in a test tube or whatever. So it means that even cells respond to it, isolated cells in culture, respond to that type of an intention. Now, this becomes more convincing. Now, how about a non-living system? You have enzymes and substrates. Enzymes, which bring about a chemical reaction, they can increase or decrease the velocity of a chemical reaction. The speed of a chemical reaction can be influenced by an enzyme. Which chemical reaction? The chemicals on which the uh, chemicals which are involved in the reaction, the speed of which gets altered by the enzyme, those chemicals are the substrates. So you have the substrate and the enzyme together in a test tube. The non-living systems, they're just chemicals. And the reaction has a certain speed, which can be influenced by temperature, etc., and many other things. But you have two sets of such tubes with the enzyme and the substrate, identical conditions in every other respect, temperature, etc., everything is identical in these two cases. But in one set of test tubes, there's a wishing, willing, or intending by a spiritual person or by an ordinary person, by a spiritual healer, by someone who doesn't have any such sort of recognized abilities. You have somebody wishing, willing, or intending that the chemical reaction should go faster or it should go slower. And you find that that also works. The reaction seems to respond, the speed of the reaction seems to respond to this type of wishing, willing, and intending. Now, this becomes even more convincing. And then there are further studies which perhaps go down even further, whether the type of random numbers that are generated by a computer, they can be influenced by wishing, willing, or intending that there should be more of random numbers in one set than in the other, say even numbers or odd numbers. So you wish and will for more even numbers in the collection of random numbers, which your computer generates in one group. In another group of computer generated numbers, you do not have any such wishing, willing, intending. Is the number of odd numbers and even numbers the same in both, or can you influence it by this? That type of positive results are also to some extent available, which means that you can influence through wishing, willing, and intending. And for that, one doesn't even have to be a spiritual healer with recognized abilities. Anybody seems to be able to influence these results in systems like chemical reactions and random number generation by computers, which means that we can influence what happens in another system, living or non-living, using our own minds. Michael Miovic, who is again a medical doctor at Harvard, uh, and who gave one of the talks in the Yes Talk series recently, he has reviewed many such studies in which the effect of visualizing, imagining, wishing, willing, or intending has been studied on animate and inanimate systems at a distance, which means the two are not in contact. And he found that this seems to work, and the distance does not matter. It's not that the distance had to be just only a few feet or a few meters. It can be across the globe, because the influence is being mediated not by a physical medium. So in that sense, it is an unmediated influence. It is not only unmediated, it's also unmitigated, which means that the distance, longer the distance, it's not that the effect becomes weaker. So distance there does neither affects the intensity of the influence nor the possibility of the influence. So this type of influence, he has found that there are many enough studies to show that it actually works. And this was published in this journal, New Approaches to Medicine and Health, which is published by Sri Aurobindo Society in Pondicherry. Now, what is the explanation for this type of results? Now, here is an explanation based on the spiritual worldview. In terms of the spiritual worldview, all manifestation is a manifestation of the divine, and therefore there's an all-pervasive presence of the spirit throughout the creation, the spirit of the creator. The spirit is something invisible, but same time it is something fundamental. For example, when we say that the spirit of the painter is there in her painting, what we mean is that although what we see is only a portrait or a landscape, some aspect of the personality of the painter has got into the painting. In the same way, some aspect of the creator has got into all its creation, and that is what we call the spirit. Now, the spirit is all pervasive and shown by these little dots. Now, two of the condensations of this spirit are these two individuals, A and B. And these condensation as an individual means that the spirit has manifested itself in a gross form in their bodies and in a subtle form in the minds of these two individuals, A and B. So, in other words, the body and the mind of A is only a special case of the manifestation of this universal spirit, and so is the case with B. And therefore, there is really no breach of continuity between A and B. The boundary marked by the skin is only a partial reality, and from the spiritual angle, one can even say that it's an illusion, because what we see is a total separation, but actually the spirit or the presence of the divine in both these individuals is the same, and it's all pervasive, and it's the spirit at the individual level that we call the soul. So the spirit and the soul are essentially the same. The spirit is universal, whereas this uh, soul is individual. The spirit is universal, and in individuals, we call it the soul. So since the soul and the spirit are essentially the same, uh, you can see there's no real breach of continuity when it comes to these dots between A and B. So if that is so, the influence of A, the mind of A on his own body or her own body, is quite understandable, because the body is only a gross manifestation of the spirit, the universal spirit, and the mind is a subtle manifestation of it. So it's one mode of consciousness influencing another, the gross mode of consciousness in A influencing the subtle mode of consciousness in A. But then when we are talking about, say, A is the healer and B is the patient, then when we are talking about the mind of A influencing the body of B, one just has to stretch the same logic a little more and say that the mind of A is a subtle manifestation of a certain consciousness, the universal consciousness, and the body of B is a gross manifestation of the same consciousness. So once again, the mind of A and the body of B are also two manifestations of the same consciousness. The mind of A is a subtle manifestation of the universal consciousness, and the body of B is a gross manifestation of the same consciousness. And there is no breach of continuity between them at the level of the spirit. And therefore, just as the mind of the A can influence the body of A, the mind of A can also influence the body of B. So this would be the spiritual explanation for how the mind of A can influence B's body, and therefore, uh, whether we call it prayer or otherwise, a healing intention on the part of A can have a positive influence on the physical disease affecting the body of B. So that will be the spiritual explanation for it. And this wider truth, deeper truth has been expressed beautifully in this quote. God is a sphere whose center is everywhere. So each individual is in a way a center, one center of a condensation of the same consciousness, which we call God. God is a sphere whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. There's no limit, there's no boundary. Now, it is in light of this now that we can again understand this, uh, that the prayer by somebody else could also help. Now, what about the scientific proof that science demands for considering these studies to be valid? looks at it dispassionately, one can say that scientific proof is available for the efficacy of healing intentions, especially the support that comes from studies on uh, animals, plants, microorganisms, cell cultures, and chemicals in a test tube. So they provide reasonable scientific proof for the efficacy of a healing intention. And the spiritual worldview, this which we saw just now, based on the spiritual worldview, provides one explanation for the observations. It's a plausible explanation, but that is not necessarily the only explanation. Because one can always have more than one explanations. One can arrive at more than one conclusion from the same observations, from the same data. All data are consistent with the spiritual worldview. One can't say that this explanation is the only explanation possible. In fact, advanced physics has other alternative explanations. So while the explanation based on the spiritual worldview is a plausible explanation, that is only one of the explanations that is possible. And since it's only consistent with the spiritual worldview, we cannot say that science has proved or disproved the spiritual worldview. In fact, science cannot prove or disprove the spiritual worldview. This would raise the same type of questions which we saw some time back, on the basis of which the conclusion reached was that a scientific study on the effects of prayer cannot be done. So science can neither prove nor disprove the spiritual worldview. And during the last 100 years also, uh, there was a tendency, particularly in uh, Western Europe and North America, which was the center of much of scientific and technological development uh, during that period, that the spiritual worldview is not really a valid worldview. It is only an edifice that has been built on the hallucinations of the mystics. That is, they were seeing something which didn't exist. And on the basis of that, they built up a whole edifice, which we call the spiritual worldview. But then this is an objection which can be easily answered because to be able to dismiss somebody's observations, these are the observations mystics. So to the mystic, they are as real as what we can see physically. They may be seen with the inner eye by the mystic, but that doesn't mean that to the spirit mystic it is any less real. For example, when Swami Vivekananda asked Sri Ramakrishna whether Sri Ramakrishna had seen God, Sri Ramakrishna told him, "Yes, I have seen God and I have seen him more clearly than I am seeing you, and I can show him to you." That was that sort of attraction that uh, held Swami Vivekananda, and he ended up sort of turning into a very sincere and intense seeker and a disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. So the spiritual worldview, so to the mystic, it is something very real. And to be able to make the same observations, instead of dismissing them as hallucinations, one has to use the same methods which the mystics use. That happens in science also. A scientist claims that a leaf, which looks just like a green sheet of paper, is actually a collection of thousands of cells. If we tell the scientist that, but I don't see the cells, what would the scientist say? The scientist would say that to see these cells, I used a microscope. If you also use a microscope, you will be able to see the cells. Which means that to be able to get the same observations which somebody else has got, we have to use the same methods. And if by using the same method, we do not make the same observations, then only we can dismiss the observations as invalid. Now, the mystic has made certain observations which to him are very real. And to be able to uh, validate those observations, we have to use the same methods which the mystic used. Now, what are the methods that the mystics have used? Whether it's the Christian and the Judaic mystics, or whether it is the rishis of the Hindu tradition, they all used basically two common things in their method. One is total absorption. intense absorption, and forgetting oneself. So it is the total absorption in the question which they are trying to investigate, and in that process, forgetting everything else. That is the type of method that they have used. So, extreme degrees of concentration to the extent that they forgot everything else, and in that process also achieved extreme degrees of self purification. So, essentially, it has been an exercise in extreme degrees of concentration, total absorption in the question, and extreme degrees of self purification, so that all other distractions, temptations were wiped out completely. These are the two basic things that have characterized the methods used by the rishis and the Sufis and the mystics. And unless the person who questions these observations is prepared to use the same methods, he cannot really question the observations, he cannot dismiss them as hallucinations. But then in the modern era, which is the era of science, because science has indeed revolutionized our lives, even those who are critical of science would not be willing to give up all the comforts that science has brought us. But all the same, the obsession with scientific proof and considering only what is scientific to be true, valid, and worthwhile, and the consequence of this sort of obsession, which is not really valid because the limits of truth are much wider than the limits of science. But this sort of obsession, the consequences of these are that there's often a misinterpretation of results. While the results of scientific studies may only show that the observations are consistent with the spiritual worldview, it is misinterpreted as proof of this spiritual worldview. That see, now science has also proven the spiritual worldview. Science has neither proved it nor disproved it. Science can neither prove it nor disprove it. And this also gives rise to a lot of pseudoscience, where a lot of things which do not fit within the framework of science are depicted in such a way as if it is something scientific to get some sort of validation, to get a certificate from scientific circles. In fact, there's a contradiction in the type of uh, two contrasting postures or stands that are taken by spiritual enthusiasts. One is that, well, science is discovering it only now. Spirituality discovered all this thousands of years ago. What the rishis have said in this uh, Upanishads, that is being documented once again by science now. So precedence is considered all important. And since we did it long ago, uh, in any case, therefore, spirituality remains superior to science. This is one stand. The other type of stand taken by the same type of spiritual enthusiasts is that science has now proved spiritual truths. While all what science has done is to, whether it's theoretical physics or whether it is studies of the type that we have been discussing today, all they have proved is that, or shown is that the findings are consistent with the spiritual worldview. That is neither proof nor denial of proof. It neither a refutation nor is it a confirmation, being consistent. This means the two are compatible. Considering both as valid does not in any way come in conflict with each other. That's all what being consistent means. So now, if spirituality is superior to science because it discovered everything long ago, then why do we need this certification from science? Why do we have to care for it so much as to say that, see, science has now proved the spiritual truths? So now, this type of stand is just as invalid as the stand taken by the hardcore scientists that the observations on which the spiritual worldview is based are mere hallucinations of the mystics. But people who understand this well like Larry Dossey, uh, have sort of seen in this uh, medicine progressing towards what he has called the era 3. Now, era 1 was the era of the spectacular developments in physical medicine, which he has placed at 1860 to 1950 or so. And then 1950 onwards, we have been seeing the growth and greater support coming uh, through studies like those in psychoneuroimmunology for mind body medicine. But then he said that that is not the end. From around 1990 onwards, we have been seeing more and more the growth of another set of developments in modern medicine, which will eventually take us to the era 3 medicine or era of non local medicine. Non-local is a non-committal sort of a term, a more neutral term, a term based on the language used in physics, which just means that the physical continuity or nearness is not necessary. Without that, there can be influences. And that has been observed in physics also, that say the spin of an electron in New Delhi can influence the spin of another electron in New York. Now, that is non-local sort of a phenomenon, which physics now considers possible. Theoretical physics considers something which happens. So here again, the patient may be present in New Delhi and the healer may be present in New York. That effects are still possible. So in that sense, it is non-local medicine. Uh, but then, if we were to think in terms of the spiritual explanation for it, one could call it the consciousness based medicine because it depends upon a unified field of consciousness, the universal spirit, which in which there is in which no physical medium required, and yet a communication is possible because of the continuity of the spirit. So anyway, so he has called this uh, type of development that he can foresee and which in a subtle way started in the 1990s with the type of studies that we have been talking about today. And this he has called will be era 3 medicine, non-local medicine. For it to become mainstream could still take some time, but it has developed enough for the mecca of modern medicine, uh, Harvard, host a whole international conference on this subject sometime in the 1990s. So therefore, people like Larry Dossey can see this eventually finding a place in modern medicine. And in fact, in one of his books, Reinventing Medicine, he has drawn a picture of what type of medicine that will be. Say there's an emergency room in the casualty to which a serious patient is brought. Now, along with everything else that is done for that patient, the hospital also maintains a list of volunteers who would be willing to pray for the patients. So just as the hospitals, if they need blood, now they get into touch with the volunteers who are willing to donate blood. So suppose there is not enough blood in the blood bank and they want blood for a patient, particularly if it's a rare blood group, then they have a list of all those volunteers who have the same blood group and they start contacting them whether they would be willing to donate blood on that day. So in this situation, they have a set in era 3, they would have a list of volunteers who are ready to pray for patients. So if there's a serious patient who comes to the emergency room, they'll contact some of those volunteers and tell them this is the type of patient who has just come. So please pray for the patient. So they'll start praying for the patient, and that could further add to whatever the effect on the patient uh, would be the result of not only what is being done in terms of physical terms, maybe in terms of a blood transfusion and other things, but some of the effect could be because of the volunteers who are praying for them. It looks like a sort of a very uh, futuristic and sometimes a speculative type of way of visualizing modern medicine, but all the same, uh, nothing is impossible. And one of the beauties of the scientific process is that it is always open to new findings and it can absorb anything into it. So the way the mind-body approach has been absorbed after rejecting it for nearly 100 years during this era of physical medicine, the mind-body approach has become quite acceptable. This approach could also become acceptable during the next 100 years. So, what Larry Dossey calls era 3 medicine, or what we may call consciousness based medicine, is something that you find in a large number of books that Larry Dossey has written on the basis of this type of studies. If we boil the whole issue down to the basics, praying for somebody is an expression of love. You love the person and therefore you pray for the person. And the result is that it brings both peace and hope to the person who is praying and the person who is being prayed for. And psychoneuroimmunological studies have shown that peace and hope are therapeutic. And peace and hope are valuable, even if the outcome is not as we would like it to be, because they are in themselves something that we all desire. So, love and prayer, in other words, are potent therapeutic tools. And this is a quote from Larry Dossey. If scientists suddenly discovered a drug that was as powerful as love in creating health, it would be heralded as a medical breakthrough and marketed overnight, especially if it had as few side effects and was as inexpensive as love. But then this should not be employed just for healing. That is where uh, the finer aspects of spirituality come in. Spirituality for its own sake, not for recovery from disease, not for getting even peace of mind, not for spiritual growth, not for making life worthwhile. These are all side effects. It's for the sake of itself. That would be the best way to approach spirituality. So, to use spirituality for a specific purpose would be a contradiction in terms, an exercise in hypocrisy. So, now we return to the same questions. Prayer is universal in difficult times, but does it help? Yes, it helps. It gives peace of mind, it gives hope. But does it work? Now, this becomes an intellectual question, and we have seen that this question is like asking whether, in response to prayer, there is a divine intervention to influence the outcome in the prayed for direction. Now, this is not something fair. We should not expect the divine to do what we want it to do. The divine knows better what it has to do. The divine knows all. The divine knows that the situation in which we are. The divine also knows what would be the best outcome in the situation in which we are. And therefore, prayer is okay. We can wish for whatever we want. We can wish for something and pray for it. But then the last line in any prayer ideally should be, this is what I want. But then if you wish otherwise, that will be equally acceptable to me. In fact, I'll be happier with that because you know better than me what is good for me. So, in other words, the effects of prayer should not be seen in terms of success the we see it. In our terms, the success would be that the outcome should be as we wished it, but we should be able to accept with equal delight, even if the outcome is just the opposite, because that is what reflects divine will and wisdom. And the divine wisdom far surpasses our limited intelligence. So, while the initial motive behind the prayer might be recovery from disease, the motive need not remain the same. The motive can be more and more of a surrender to the divine will, because the divine knows better what is the best to happen. And finally, the prayer can become completely motiveless. It is just the relationship, the personal relationship that we have built up with the divine that we enjoy. That is all that we want. As Sri Aurobindo says in this quote and the next one, as we grow spiritually, the motives of prayer become higher and higher until we reach the highest motiveless devotion, which is that of divine love, pure and simple, without any other demand or longing. The efficacy of prayer is often doubted. It It is not then the giving of the thing asked for that matters, but the relationship itself, the contact of man's life with God, the conscious interchange. So it's this personal relationship that one builds up that is the true, most valuable outcome of prayer if it is approached properly. It is this result that is guaranteed 100%. Suggested reading: there are several books of Larry Dossey. Here are two of them: Prayer is Good Medicine and Healing Words, Reinventing Medicine. Be careful for what you pray for, you just might get it. These are the two books also that I have read for. I'm grateful. Healing Words and Reinventing Medicine. And of course, Wikipedia is and Google Images help a lot in getting information as well as making it more presentable. Questions and comments are welcome. You may write to us on yes@yesspirituality.com. Gratitude to the Mother and Sri Aurobindo for making these sessions possible. And thank you all for being there.
The question is, can you please share the methodologies of the mystics again?
The methodology is intense concentration, and that eventually leads to extreme degrees of self-purification as well. Now, intense concentration is possible only if you are really, if the aspiration is truly sincere and intense and persistent, unshakable. And if one is totally absorbed in something and absorbed in some difficult questions which are extremely difficult to answer through our usual resources, then if the person is passionately involved in it, then many other things which otherwise appear necessary or interesting in life, they start falling out of life. And once they start falling out of life, the necessities become very few, and anything which obstructs or contradicts that, that disappears from life. Many ordinary things which may be otherwise harmless, they also start falling out. And the result is an extreme degree of simplification as well as purification of the individual. So it's the combination of this extreme degree of concentration, total absorption, which results in turn from a persistent, intense, and sincere aspiration. And this leads in turn, this concentration in turn leads to simplification and purification. So this is the methodology of the mystics, which has been universal.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please, you can ask.
Yeah. So I think at the beginning you had mentioned, Dr. Bijlani, that there's usually a trigger or a reason to turn towards spirituality. And while that is fine, it's very important to, after that, grow in your journey so it becomes motiveless and there is complete surrender. Yeah, I think that's beautiful. How does one do that? Because my understanding is that, or at least my experience is that one tends to oscillate a lot in this journey. So how does one become more consistent in this surrender?
So one can sort of take it this question up in two parts. One is that how does one move from turning to the divine because of being in trouble? That is starting with the motive that my difficulties should disappear or my problems should disappear. How does this miserable person uh, move from the motive of uh, overcoming this misery to a higher and purer motive? So how does he do it? Firstly, I mean, there's no set method for it. Probably it will depend a lot upon the opening or the receptivity of the person, which in turn might depend upon the homework that the person had put in previous lives and what this person has been doing with this life before he became miserable. So all that would determine how much of a receptivity he has built up so that this trigger was enough for him to now give a new direction to his life. And that is how this will become uh, more and more motiveless. This will just serve as a trigger or as a wake up call, but uh, which is sometimes necessary. But the preparation had already been put in, the preparation had already been going on in previous lives as well as in this life till this event actually happened. So that is how it can happen. Uh, just the knowledge of this also might help some people become a little more receptive, knowing that this is what how it can happen. So that's how perhaps even a little knowledge can help, apart from the other preparation that was going on. But to what extent this knowledge will help is doubtful. What is more, because we know so many things, but we can't put them into practice. Perhaps what is more important is the inner change that had been going on and the level of spiritual evolution that has been achieved, and therefore the receptivity that has been built up as a result of how the much development took place in the previous lives and in this life. The other is oscillation, that this one oscillates between being extremely receptive, uh, being on a different path, suddenly feeling that, oh, this path is so rewarding and so comforting. So now this is my path for the rest of my life. But then one can't stay there, one slides down. So that is actually, in fact, very true on the spiritual path. It's not a linear path, it's a zigzag path. Oscillations are there. That is also a part of it. But then there is a positive way of looking at it. The positive way is that the so called nights of yoga, when you are going through those dark phases during which not much progress is taking place, sometimes even a sliding down is taking place, those can be again a preparation for another leap which will come after some time, maybe once again as a result of yet another trigger. So it's a path in which oscillation is also to be accepted as a part of the process. And if one understands that, then probably the oscillation will be used properly, it will serve its purpose, and also the sliding down will not last too long. But all the same, these oscillations are also inevitable.
Thank you so much. That helps. Thank you.
Thank you for asking that question. That was indeed a good question. I'm sure it helped many of us.
All right, if there are no more questions, then maybe we can end with a moment of silence. Thank you, everyone.